Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. I'm here with Paul Gilbert, and we're going to be talking about the relationship of empathy and compassion. But before we do that, let's just introduce ourselves, and I'll model that. As I said, I'm Edwin Rutsch from, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and for about the past 14 years, I've been working on creating a more empathic society. So empathy is sort of the central organizing value that I'm working on. We do all kinds of different projects. We have trainings. We have something called the empathy tent that we take out to public places to offer listening. And I just ran for Congress as the empathy candidate. It just was, yeah. So for 6 months, I was running in the primary. I didn't win. So anyway, I'll talk more about that later. But yeah, Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, Edwin, thank you. Wow, great that you're running for Congress. That's fantastic. So firstly, thank you for inviting me. And we chatted about this some years ago, and I'm a great admirer of the work that you're doing. I think it's absolutely wonderful, wonderful work. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I did my PhD back in 1980, whenever it was, at Edinburgh University. I got my PhD from Edinburgh, and I'm very interested in evolutionary approaches to mental health problems, the way that the mind has evolved, and have been studying compassion for quite a few years, because many of the clients that we work with find it very difficult to be compassionate to themselves, or sometimes compassionate to others. They're pretty hostile to other people. So I've been looking at that. And of course, empathy is a crucial element of compassion, because if you don't have empathy skills, compassion is very tricky. But we see compassion from a motivational point of view. We have a foundation, as Edwin might mention later, called the Compassionate Mind Foundation, which is an international foundation to promote the science and implementation of compassionate science to create well-being, basically. And so you can come and see our website. So that's me, really, sort of a clinical psychologist who's been developing compassion and compassion-focused therapy.
Yeah, so you're a big name in compassion. I mean, you're going to conferences, you're out there writing, so you're really advocating for, I would say compassion is a central organizing, cultural, personal value. And I'm seeing empathy is that cultural, that value that we need, and trying to promote that, even like I was saying, running for Congress under the empathy as the empathy candidate. So it was about building an empathy movement. So we wanted to maybe talk about the relationship of empathy and compassion. How are they similar? Where they overlap? What's the relationship? And you were, before we just recorded, you were telling the story of how you got started. Did you want to continue with that story?
Yeah, a little bit, because so this might be interesting, because the run-ins would take me a minute or two, but basically using cognitive therapy during the 80s and early 90s. And in that approach to therapy, you help people identify thoughts that are linked to their problems. So people who have depression tend to have depressing thoughts, like I'm a failure, I'm no good. People who are anxious have anxious thoughts, like the world is a dangerous place, or I'm going to have a heart attack and die, or something like that. So there's a link between thinking and feeling. And if you can help people balance their thoughts to bring more evidence into their thoughts and break up the loop between thinking and feeling, that could be helpful. So, and that is helpful for people. But sometimes people will say, well, look, I know that my thoughts aren't rational or real, and I know I'm not responsible for my abuse, or I know I'm not really a failure, but I just feel that I am. So these are sticking points. Sometimes people can do cognitive work, but they don't change emotionally. And so one day, one particular client who had a very chronic depression, many suicide attempts, who'd been adopted and felt she shouldn't have been born, and had a really deep sense of unlovability, but had actually got a good relationship with her partner, with her husband, and had 3 lovely children, had held down a job. So she was able to stand back from these negative views about herself as unlovable and say, well, actually, I do have people around me who care about me, including my children, my partner, but I still feel this real sense of loss and unlovability. And so usually what you do is you just try to get them to practice and have more evidence. But one day I decided to kind of explore it in a different way. So I asked her So how do you hear those thoughts in your mind, you know, when you're thinking, well, you know, I've got a family that care about me and a husband that cares about me. Can you actually speak them out as you hear them? And we call this the first shock of CFT, because she said, she was quite embarrassed, but she said, okay. And she said, okay, this is how I hear them in my mind. Come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got a husband who really cares about you. You got some lovely children. You've held down a job. You got friends. And it was a sort of, so what have you got to be depressed about? Which is, from your point of view, from my point of view, a complete lack of empathy. So that hostility actually also showed this immense lack of empathy for the intense pain that she was in because of her depression. And even when she was trying to be helpful, she was very hostile to herself. So we discovered that some of the problem wasn't being carried in the channel of cognition. It was in this a really emotional attacking self, which completely lacked any empathy for the damage and the harm and the hurt that attack was doing. So that was the first shot. The second thing was then to say, okay, well, the obvious thing was, okay, can we warm it up? You know, can we help you to have a more compassionate orientation, a softer tone, a kinder tone to your thoughts, an emotional tone that was really focused in caring behavior with the real motivation to become more empathic to your distress, to the pain you've carried for all these years of feeling lonely and unlovable. And she said, no, I'm not doing that. Why would I want to do that? And the third, so they saw it as weak, it wouldn't help them. And the third thing was, when people did start to get empathy for their distress, when that did happen, that opened a real can of problems, because all emotional, all motivational systems, like the carry system or the competitive system or the sexual system, can carry their own trauma memory. So for example, if you like going on holidays and you love holidays and you go on holidays, you're motivated to holidays, but then one year you get badly beaten up. The following year, when you see things about holidays, that trauma will be re-triggered, and you won't remember all the wonderful holidays. You will be hit by the trauma. Now, it's the same in the caring system, that when you start people to kind of develop a caring orientation to themselves, they will then begin to stimulate their attachment systems and caring systems. If they've got trauma in that, that's what starts to come out. So what we found was that when people did begin to become more compassionate to themselves and have more empathy to their pain and more ability to be able to mentalize their history and so on and so on, that actually then created quite a lot of, that opened up a can of pain, basically, as one patient said to me. And then they had to do a lot of the grief work, and doing the grief work for the abuse or for the neglect or for the love they never had, all that stuff, becoming empathic to that pain, that was a real important process of recovery.
Okay, so that sounds like that was sort of a pivotal moment for you, where you sort of had
Yeah.
some deeper insight about,
Yeah.
so how do you work, how do you support people, help people work through some kind of internal issues and judgments and pain.
Yeah.
And that was like kind of an insight, the importance of empathy and compassion for doing that.
Yeah, very much.
Okay. Well, the work I'm doing is very much based on Carl Rogers, you know, with empathic listening. So Carl Rogers used empathic listening in his therapeutic process. So he would have this non-directed approach that he would be, you know, people would come to him and he would listen for basically for an hour and accompany them, sort of an empathic, an accurate empathy, trying to really hear and be with them and accompany them on their internal mental journey, kind of exploring these different issues. And from that point, you know, it's kind of where I've been building, working on, you know, looking at empathy, not just in the therapeutic context, but hey, how do we have it just in our families and our relationships and our society, and how do we make empathy a primary social and cultural value? And, you know, politicians like Barack Obama have talked about, hey, we need, you know, there's this empathy deficit in society. And so that's, yeah, kind of was the sort of the starting point for me. And also taking empathy from being, like you're talking about empathy in a clinical context, a therapist listening to a client, like Rogers listened to the clients, but we've been working on how do we have mutual empathy and taking it out of just the client therapist relationship, but how do we, how does that woman that you're, talking about, how does she have like a more empathic relationship with her family, for example? And that's so I kind of focus on this process called the empathy circle, which is, small groups doing mutual empathic listening with each other. So that's, kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I mean, one of the interesting things to ask you really is that kind of what would motivate people to take an empathic journey, because it's a journey. The other thing about empathy, which you make clear, is that it's not necessarily automatic. There can be an automatic connection, what we call emotional contagion, but there can also be a lot of work, thinking and imagining and practicing. One of the things, like with racism, for example, rather than thinking about shame and white man's burden and all the rest of it, is to take an empathic journey about, imagine that was me, imagine that was my wife I saw chained up, imagine that was my wife I saw thrown over the boat because she was sick, imagine it was me that was being. That ability to take an empathic journey into the pain of the other is absolutely crucial, I think. But what I'm interested in, and you do that, you make this point brilliantly, but what would motivate people to do that? Because when you're empathic, you have to go into pain. You have to go, you're not being empathic to people's winning the lottery. We need people to be empathic to the struggles and the pain of others. So how do you motivate them to do that?
Yeah, so you're really looking like, how do we get people into the empathy circle, or valuing empathy to want to kind of make that central to their life or society? And well, I would say that a lot of the differences, empathy, compassion, I think comes down to like how we're defining our terms, because it's like you look into the literature, on empathy, and the definitions are all over the place. And I've already heard you saying sort of different aspects of empathy. So I would start with maybe my definition, that I see empathy as a way of being. There's a paper, Carl Rogers, one of his last, papers was called Empathic and Unappreciated Way of Being, where he sort of consolidated a lot of his thinking about empathy into this paper, the benefits, how it works, his definition. And so building on that, I would say there's an empathy for me is a way of being. Being as an individual or here together with you, how do we have a mutually empathic way of being, or in a group that we have an empathic way of being? And that means to be sensitive to the felt experience of others, which is not necessarily an imaginative, part. It's just that listening, being present, feeling into someone's, their presence. And then that would be sort of maybe the first step, you do an active listening, accompanying someone, being present with them, not being judgmental or doing all the blocks, that the things that do block that sort of presence. And then there's the what I would call imaginative empathy, which is what you'd sort of identified, is that we can sort of do role play. We can step into any role. I can imagine myself in the future. I can imagine you going to a conference and you're concerned about COVID. I can imagine myself there, or I can imagine you being there, And so I would say there's the empathy, sensing into, there's imaginative empathy, which is often, sometimes the cognitive empathy. They use the term different aspects of cognitive empathy, or imagining yourself in the other person's situation, or yourself in their situation. And you can extrapolate imagination. You can imagine anything, right? I can imagine myself being what's it like to be a banana, or just, you name it. Imagination, I think it was, it's sort of unlimited what we can imagine. So I see that as a separate sort of a category of type of empathy, sensing into something. and then sensing, feeling what comes up. Then there's self-empathy, which is, sensing into your own felt experience. And I define it within the context of the empathy circle. So we have an empathy circle process. There's usually 4 people in a circle. One person is the speaker, one person is the listener. The speaker shares, what's alive for them or on some topic. The listener reflects back their understanding, accompanies the speaker on their journey. And then we have a time limit, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. And then the listener becomes the speaker and speaks to someone else in the circle. And we just keep going around for maybe a couple hours with this process. So in that process, the listener is sensing into what the speaker is saying. The silent listeners, who are just sitting silently, are also sensing into the dynamics there. And then the speaker is sort of exploring their own internal thoughts and sensing into their thoughts, which I would consider to be self-empathy. And that listening by others kind of helps them, supports them in feeling into their own self, experiences that are arising. And then the imaginative empathy in that context is, I've done like conflict mediation, for example, where we use the empathy circle for conflict mediation. And then one of the people, maybe the father, can't attend this, but you can have someone role play the father in this mediation. And you say the father is very introverted, very domineering, and the person role plays what the father is like. And more often than not, it's like the other people in the circle are saying, that is amazing. That's exactly how he is, so that's sort of that imaginative empathy where you can kind of do role play. Or another role play is similar to what you're talking about with your that woman, that story, is we had someone in our circle who would have creative thoughts. She would judge her thoughts, and then it was painful. So she didn't even want to do creativity anymore because her creativity was always self-judged. And then it was so painful. It's like, I don't want any ideas, new ideas. So we role played that. I became her creativity. Somebody else became her judgment. And, so you can role play different, scenario parts of a person. And then she could sit back and watch those parts actually dialogue with each other and empathize with each other. So that would be what I would call imaginative empathy. So,
yeah, it's fascinating. It's a bit like psychodrama, isn't it? They do the kind of, becoming the different parts and giving an opportunity to externalize. And then from that position, you can then empathize with the, yeah, that's right. We have a system in called compassion focused therapy, which is called multiple selves, where we would invite somebody to take a situation of conflict, like having a conflict with somebody that you care about, and then they would become the angry part, and then the anxious part, and then the sad part, and then the compassion would come in and empathize with the angry part and empathize. So that, because these parts otherwise fight with each other all the time. So yeah, I think that's a really important part of the process of actually being able to stand back and then empathize these different parts. That's a really key therapeutic maneuver. Yeah, that's great. Well, a question I want to ask you though is, but why bother?
oh, the motivation part. I didn't answer your motivation part, right? I
I'm always
was giving the context, and
Yeah,
I didn't answer why bother with it exactly. Yeah, thanks for bringing me back to that. I got so excited explaining the model. So
it is exciting. It's a lovely
yeah,
model.
we in the empathy circle, when people take part, we ask, how was the experience? It was, you hear a lot like, hey, this felt really good. I felt heard, I felt seen. So it feels good to be felt and seen. And it feels good to have that sense of connection with others. And, you brought up the topic of racism, for example. So we have had Empathy Cafe. Empathy Cafe is like, 70 people come, you divide into groups, you give a little couple of words at the beginning. You divide into empathy circles, 4 or 5 to a circle. And the topic was empathizing with racism. What comes up for you with that? So we did that topic, and it's like people were saying, this is really great. Usually the topic has become so polarized, like you're a racist or you're not a racist. It becomes very polarized. And in this space, people had to listen to each other and actually hear each other out and get into the nuances and not feel shut down. So that feeling of being heard and seen feels damn good. I mean, Carl Rogers talked about that. Empathy feels damn good. And I think it's that positive feeling that is one of the motivations. And then people also talk about, going to their family and kind of using empathic listening. And it feels good to be able to listen and have some tools and processes for a constructive dialogue and for being heard and seen as well. So I would say those are some of the motivations.
Yeah, so it's the experience creates the motive, is that right?
Yeah, I would say people have maybe had some motivation that they have sort of problems or looking for solutions. So they come across this. So yeah, that would be the experience deepens, the motivation to continue. But how do you get people initially starting, maybe?
To be interested in addressing, how do you get
Mhm.
them interested in addressing racism? How do you get them interested in doing the work? I mean, that's the point. I mean, we have the same issue. How do you get people interested in compassion? Because they say, well, why should I be compassionate? Why do I want to be compassionate to immigrants? All these people coming from Mexico, why do I want to do that? I keep them out. I don't want to bother with. So getting people to take an interest in the well-being and the suffering of others, that is our first point, and that's a tricky bit, that thing. I'm not quite sure. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what your thoughts are.
So that's what sounds like that's what you're working on. You're wanting to, how do you get the general public even interested in this topic? And you're looking for ways of, it's almost like, it's almost like what marketing would be like. Marketing's trying to bring people in and motivate them. And it's like, that's an ongoing sort of question. That's why I ran for Congress. I was the empathy candidate, and it was to get out in public and say, hey, we need a more empathic society. We need to make empathy a primary social value. And so I was just trying to raise the awareness in the public. And you go to forums. I was with the other candidates. They have like the debates or forums, and I'd be advocating for more empathic society. So that was one process. We have this empathy tent that I mentioned that before COVID, we would take it out to these demonstrations where the political right would come to Berkeley, which is a very liberal place, and they would be demonstrating for free speech, etc. And then the political left would be coming to counter demonstrate, Antifa, and they had these knockdown, drag out fights. And we would be there with, a very public tent that says empathy, come and we'll listen to you. And we mediated, tried to mediate between the sides and got a lot of publicity there. So it seems to be a lot of different, sort of activities like that to kind of get the word out. Those are some process. But what have you found that's been useful?
But I mean, I think what you're talking is that you have been developing the process by which people can begin to break down barriers of misunderstanding and, seeing, because a lot of the barriers are to do with threat. I see you as a threat. The moment I see you as a threat, I don't want to understand you. I just want to stop you, control you, or in the extreme, even harm you. And so that's the key issue, particularly on the right, particularly when, the idea that the government's a threat. They're coming to take away your money and your taxes, or they want to take away your guns, or they want to flood the country with immigrants. It's all threat, you see. And so part of compassion is to how do you deal with helping people feel less threatened so that they can then become open to it. And so the key then is then when they become open, then you can invite them to think about empathy. But it also works the other way around, in the sense that when people are forced into taking empathy, like they they're forced to kind of interact with immigrants or refugees or whatever, and they kind of form a relationship with them, then their compassion will grow from that. It's when they can keep the other out there, so they don't have to empathize with you. That's the problem. But the moment they are able to form a relationship, then the interest in empathy can begin to flourish and compassion can flourish. So that our key issue is all the time, how do you deal with the threat system? Because that's the thing that constantly blocks people's motivation to be empathic or to care, you know.
Yeah, that's, I mean, it's the same issue, you know, in terms of the vote. I got 3% of the votes. That tells you kind of the interest level in the society. It's like, oh, when I was at the empathy tent, we'd have, you know, 200 on the right, 200 or 300 on the left, you know, battling it out in the parks here in Berkeley. I mean, they're knockdown, drag out fights where I mean, they're bloody. People are beating you know, physically beating each other up in fist fights and throwing, you know, explosives, M80s or cherry bombs at each other. And it's total mayhem. And there's, you know, so we're talking about 500 people there, and in the empathy tent is 4 or 5 people, right? And I thought, well, that's about a 1%, right, of the people in this dynamic. And I thought, well, maybe there's a silent majority out there who's just afraid to go to these conflicts. But it seems to be about a 1%, you know, people who are really, you know, supporting this at a deeper level. So I'm in the same question, like how to raise that that sort of social awareness. And usually, you know, movements when they get started, like you know, the Black Lives Matter, etc., there was a big social people being out on the streets, right? It's like they get out on the streets, there's demonstrations, and then it starts moving its way through the social system structures. You know, it kind of gets incorporated. So maybe I thought maybe we need like an Occupy empathy, you know, encampments, you know, say we want empathy and, you know, camping out and making sort of a social sort of a movement there. So, and that's the other thing I'm trying to do now is kind of focusing on the concept or idea of it's an empathy movement that we need to build. So just like any other movement, you know, the women's, you know, rights, voting rights, civil rights, etc. They've all been sort of movements. And so maybe we need a social movement to build that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, you know, and I mean, you know, in days gone by when we had religions, religions was, you know, we're all created by God equally, all that stuff. And you would have thought that that would have then been enough for people to say, okay, so we're all the same, so we need to understand and work together. But even the religious views did not prevent people from behaving incredibly cruelly. I mean, slavery flourished in Christian societies, right? So even if you have a dictate that we're all the same, we're all blah, blah, even that from a God, even that doesn't work. So the question is we are moving, as you say, to being much more interested in things like, you know, gender issues and racism and so forth. So we are moving to become more empathic, and it's kind of interesting in how that is happening. I think obviously people like yourself and others are kind of pushing this as a very important thing, but to try and capture the natural process within society that is moving us to become more empathic, because I think we are. I mean, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the time. Of course, there's some terrible things as well. But I mean, what do you think is happening in society so that we are more empathic than we were, say, 100 years ago, when America was a very racist society, but it's still racist, but and so is UK, but we are less so. How has that happened, do you think?
Yeah, that's how did that overall arc? I mean, I see polarization actually growing at the moment. So I'm not sure I see.
That's the 1 step back. Yes, that's
Yeah,
the
it's kind of
back.
like 2 steps back almost. You know, it's yeah, because it's like even people, you know, on the political left, I just see as becoming very polarized. I mean, people who I would consider to be sort of in the middle are kind of being pushed to the more towards the extremes, seeing the political right is sort of almost like evil, and vice versa. So I'm not really sure. It's what is one, there's different levels maybe that at one level, when we go to the empathy tent and we have the political right and political left there, I just can listen to both sides, and I enjoy listening to both sides. I enjoy, bringing the sides together. But I see that sort of that fear, like you're talking about, fear of the other side kind of pulling people apart. I mean, even in my family, it's like I see that we have Trump supporters and liberals, and they're just kind of even getting more polarized too. So yeah, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it's linked to Trump. I mean, what's interesting, isn't it, is that, after the Second World War, America had the New Deal, and we had, we built a National Health Service, we built new universities, we built all kinds of national services. We didn't have any money. We owed the Americans loads. We just fought a war, right? But we had this real psychology to build a better world, to build a more equal world, to build a world that everybody wanted to live in. And that was a psychology that lasted for about 15 years. And then came the 60s. And the 60s were interesting because it was a big turning point, because yes, the 50s were really about building the community, building the society, having a sense of responsibility for the other. But the 60s then produced a new freedom, which was freedom of self-expression. And it then became, yeah, but what about me? I want to hang out. I want to do what I want to do, without the responsibility for the other.
Mm-hmm.
That was a beginning. We started to lose, we had this time of flowers in your hair and all you need is love. But underneath that was very much this idea about self-expression and the individual. And then, of course, as we moved into the 70s and 80s, we had Reagan and Thatcher that brought in neoliberalism, which was then competitiveness. It's about you, it's what you do. It's about the tribe you belong to. Will your politicians vote for your interests and so on? So it's all very much fragmented. And the problem that we've got, and you've got a media who really like to stir it up and sell it, because they sell the blood on the carpet, don't they? So they really like creating these things. So you've got a lot of processes within society that are really pushing on the door of division, and really pushing people into the more extremes, the more tribal identities of good and all that stuff, which we've seen throughout history. But the question for both of us as individuals who want to see a more compassionate world is, how do you stop it? I mean, how do you bring people back to the idea that we as a society, as a species, actually, we need to be working together. We've got climate change, we've got another virus around the corner, we've got so many issues, we've got wars going on all over the place, we've got so many issues that we can really only address if we come together and develop cooperative, caring solutions. We need to develop a caring solution, a solution that shows a caring interest to address the sources of suffering. So that's what we're really interested in, and address some of these other forces which are about creating divisions and competition and threat and so forth. So, and empathy has to be a core part of that story. It has to be. The people on the right are the same as me. They have children. They want to see their children grow. They want to love their families. They want to have a future. They want to, all that stuff. So it's really helping people see, what do we have in common? What are our common interests? Not what are our common positions. Our common positions are in the tribes, but what are our common interests? A common interest is to create a society where people can be free, of course, that's important, where people can be free from violence, where people can be free from hunger, people can be free from disease. And in order to do that, we need to actually pull all of our resources and all of our intelligence and work cooperatively to do that. And we have to resist the tendency to be put into tribalism and create tribal hatreds. Tribal hatreds are very easy to create, and we've been doing it for thousands of years, and some of the results have been absolutely horrific. So the compassionate position is, how can we use empathy? How can we get people to be empathic to the division? It's all very well being empathic to your people you like, but how can you be empathic and reach out to people that maybe you don't like so much or you see as different to you. So I think that's where all the work you're doing is so fundamental, is bridging the divide over the individuals who are seen as the outsider, are seen as the other. Whereas if you can empathically engage with them to see, no, they're not the other. They are another human being that just like you have needs and worries and fears and hopes and aspirations. How we can get to that, bridge that, as opposed to seeing them as the bad. No, they're a human being just like you.
So you're looking at sort of the recent history, like, the different values that have kind of gone through society and to come to the point where we are now. And now how do we kind of make this cultural shift, like put empathy, and you're saying compassion sort of as the central,
at the center
as a central value. And within the context of how the society has actually sort of been involved, has been evolving, different values sort of percolate through the culture and now what do we do? And I guess for me, it's creating the movement. Like we need it's like everything, women's vote came through a movement, and it took a long time. Civil rights took a movement. So I've started saying, putting that front and center, is like, hey, we're part of a movement here, and to create a sense of maybe a identity that, being part of others, a community that wants to create this movement, and what are the values of that movement? For me, it's just willing. We have free speech, which I'm a total, proponent of, but what's missing is the free empathy, right? And saying we have to have everybody be able to express themselves, be open and about where they are, but then somebody has to be able to listen, and can we mutually listen to each other, and raise that as a cultural value, and we needing a movement, and to do that. So.
Yeah, and the point I think where you and I join is that we're interested in motivation. But okay, so I'm motivated now, but what do I do? So what are the skills now? What are the skills? So the skills of engaging empathically with the other are empathy. They're the skills that you need. Otherwise, the other person remains a stranger to you. And this is why understanding that this common sense of that this is a human being just like me, they didn't choose to be here, they just got born, here they are. This capacity to understand that people's minds are pretty much the same. We all want pretty much to be free of suffering. We pretty much want to have a meaningful life. We want to be loved rather than hated. So how we have empathy for the commonality of what it is to be a human being, the commonality of our fears. Most of us are frightened of dying, perhaps, or dying with cancer or something like that. So how do we develop that? Because the point that you make, I think, repeatedly, is that empathy is the way to connect to the other. You may want to connect to the other, but empathy is the bridge to do it. And so it's about having these two things together: the motivation, why that's important, and also the competencies to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of motivation, is they say it's usually a couple, they go 7 years of sort of dysfunction before they go to therapy, relational therapy. So the motivation is the pain becomes so great that they say, I got to find something else. So that might be part of it, is people just have to get into so much pain and dysfunction that they get a divorce and things get really bad, or they start looking for other solutions. So I don't know, how does that resonate with you?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And as you get the same in war, often bring people to the table, and it's the point that they get exhausted and they realize that actually this isn't going to, nobody's going to win. And then you can look at their mutual interests, because people often have positions, don't they? This might be, but actually what is in your common interest, right? If you can get people to what is your common interest, not your position, I'm for this, I'm for this, I'm for this. Well, maybe you are, but what is your common interest? Are we interested in having a planet that we can live on? Are we interested in doing that? Okay, Because if we're interested in doing that and addressing the issues of climate change, okay, it doesn't really matter if you're on the left or the right. We need to know the science that would do it. There's no point just making up ideas. Can we agree then that we need to work out the best ways to address climate change? Can we agree that we need to work out ways in which we can deal with viruses as they begin to? Because we've been lucky, you know. Viruses are very common. You know, they've been wiping out humans for for thousands of years. We've been quite lucky to be free of them. COVID is a bit of a wake-up call, actually. So there are so many common problems that we need to address. And it's getting people to kind of realize we have a common humanity. And the point you said that I really, really like is that people do like to belong to something. So starting a movement that people can belong to, that actually maps out values, maps out things people can do, maps out common activities that we can all share and agree to do. When you get that, then people will come in and join you because they want to be with like-minded others, people who think like them, behave like them, will push for the same values. And I personally believe that compassionate, empathic values is very common. People really would like that, but there's no, at the moment, movement or group that they can join or feel part of or share ideas with. So starting a movement would be terrific.
Yeah, we do. I mean, the empathy circle is sort of the foundational practice. So it's dialogic. Like you're in relationship all the time, right? You're always talking to someone, your family, and so the empathy circles, you know, small groups, learning empathic listening skills, being heard. I see as sort of this core part, kind of a core foundational practice. So we offer these online, so anybody can drop in, take part in an empathy circle. They get heard, they get seen, they learn the skills of listening to others. And then we have empathy circle facilitation training, so that's online as well, and people can you know, learn to facilitate an empathy circle. It's easy. It's a very easy practice that, you know, most people, you can just read the instructions and just do it. You know, you don't need like a lot of training because you're just learning active listening, and there's videos and so forth. So it can be self-replicating. There's people like, you know, we're teaching people, I think we've done, you know, several hundred, you know, people have taken the training. People join as trainees, and they learn how to train to become a trainer of the process. So it's very scalable. And, you know, there's people holding empathy circles, you know, all over the world. So I see that as sort of a first core practice that's very scalable. And with that basic practice, the empathy circle, you pretty much can bring a conflict into it. And if people just have to actively listen to each other, you know, before you say your piece, you have to be able to listen and understand the person to their satisfaction, you know, reflect back to their satisfaction before you can say your piece. And your piece, you're welcome to say your piece, anything you want, it's total free speech, any emotion. But first you got to listen to the other person. And in return, they're going to listen to you, to your satisfaction. And so I just see that as like a core practice that we're of this movement, you know, so we can start, and there's all kinds of stuff that can be built on that. There's, you know, for conflict mediation, we're doing restorative empathy circles. So kind of extra tools on that foundation for mediating conflict. If you look at, I know the compassion community is often saying, oh, we do action and empathy doesn't do action. But if you look at like human-centered design, if you're familiar with human-centered design, the design community, empathy is a core component of that process. You know, that process says if you want to design any solution, the first thing you do is you empathize with the needs, problems of the people you're designing for. And then you know, find, so the pain points, you go into a creativity mode, you create prototypes, you test those prototypes, and then you start the whole iterative process again. So I think it can go in a lot of directions, but I just see this as sort of the kind of a first step that's very scalable.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, compassion is very keen on behavior. I know there might be some models that say it isn't, but actually compassion is very important. There's no point in saying, I feel for your pain, but actually I'm not going to do anything about it. That's a waste of time. So compassion drives action. That's the point. It drives compassionate courage and wisdom. I mean, a firefighter entering into a burning house to save somebody, I mean, that's a compassionate act. They're risking their lives to save somebody, right? That's action. So action is very, very important. And the point that you're saying, we often say, is that action must be based on wisdom, because you can do things that are not. How do you get wisdom? We get wisdom through empathy. That's how you get it. I mean, there isn't any other way. Emotional wisdom comes from empathy. You have to understand the other. And as you say, one of the ways of doing that is listening. Very, very important. How do you listen? How can you listen in such a way that you're open, not defensive? Because if you're listening to somebody, say, in a couple's dispute, and they're complaining about you, you never come home at night, you're always working too hard, or whatever it is. How can you listen in such a way that you can really see it from their point of view, rather than just defending yourself against their annoyances? So these are really important skills that you're talking about, Edwin.
Yeah, so it's the listening, learning those listening skills and disseminating those skills as widely as possible. Yeah, is definitely core, and that's what the empathy circle is. It's sort of a practice space for doing that. So you're constantly learning those skills, and then you can take that to your family. Hold family empathy circles. Is so there's something else I wanted to say. Somehow I can't quite remember what it was.
Yeah. The other thing you were saying about starting movement, I mean, one of the things we're interested in, I mean, we've got various ideas about this, but is how you form an interconnected network. I mean, for example, you've got empathy circles all over the world, but can they become part of the empathy circle organization? Do you have an internet? Do you have an email communication list where people communicate with each other and they can feel part of this organization? Yeah. Do you have that?
We do, yeah, and we have an email list, and I think that's really what I'm looking at too. Is what you're identifying is that you're part of this movement. You have like you have. There's a feeling of connection and warmth, and it's like, oh, and maybe even trust too, because I think core to trust is that you're talking about wisdom and taking action. Yeah, that it's like that sort of. Trust is a big part, knowing that you will be heard and seen, right? It's like usually, and that's what builds trust, is knowing that you're going to listen to me if we have conflict or something, you're going to be willing to listen and understand where I'm coming from. We might not agree, but at least we're willing to sort of work it out. And I think that builds a lot of trust. And the other part is the action component. I think that one thing with the definition of empathy, it gets defined in an individualistic term. Like therapy is the therapist listens to the client, and empathy is sort of defined as this one person, this individual listening to others. Whereas what's needed is mutual empathy. It's like, if there's a problem, it's not like, hey, I'm just going to feel sorry for you. And, my pain of maybe feeling sorry, I'm going to try to take some kind of action. It's like, let's dialogue with each other and negotiate how we take action together. So it's a mutually negotiated and sort of agreed upon action. I'm sure you've seen that with those couples you're talking about, right? That they're totally pissed off with each other. They start listening. You get them to listen to each other, hear each other. They start seeing, oh, I start understanding why you're doing what you're doing. It kind of makes sense. They find some kind of core understanding or some values that they share, and then it's like, what do we do now? And they negotiate. Well, how about we do this? No, that doesn't work for me, but how about this? How about that? And they come to some kind of a program of what they're going to do together. So it's a mutually negotiated thing. Like, it's not like, hey, I'm just going to help you, but let's be sure that if I'm doing something, it's really what it is that you're wanting and needing, and we have some kind of agreement around that.
Yeah, that's the compassionate part from us, is it's saying that you're wanting and needing. So what we do in couples therapy is we do what you say, where we invite each partner to speak for 2 to 3 minutes about their issue, and then the other partner has to listen. They can't say anything and simply repeat back to show, and then they change over, but then they switch. So if it's a husband and a wife, it's male and female, then the wife becomes the husband becomes the wife, and then they have to go through the whole thing again, and then talk about that, whether they've experienced it. And then at some point they move into their compassionate selves, and then they have to say, my compassionate self wants to bring this into the relationship. My compassionate self wants to offer this to you. My compassionate self wants to see you grow and flourish in this way, and I will help you. So they have to then do that compassion part, and that can sometimes be quite interesting, but it's very, very useful. This switching, constant switching around, the husband becoming the wife becoming the husband, they're moving into different mind states. They can practice just being in the angry state. We only want to talk to angry self. What does angry self think about both of you? What does compassionate self? What is your greatest hope for the relationship? How would you like to see your partner grow or not grow? So all of those empathic steps, I think, are absolutely essential. They are the practices, the process. You have to engage in them. You have to do them to be able to experience them.
So you're doing imaginative, the husband is imagining being the wife, speaking from her point of view, or vice versa.
They do chairs and they sit in opposite chairs.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of shifting, getting that different perspective taking. The other part is, it's creating these skills and integrating these skills into the family. Like, it seems to me that, when the couple, before they even get married or once they get married, that they're learning these empathic listening skills, maybe doing some empathy circles in the family before the conflict happens. So that these skills are sort of integrated into the family dynamics, and how do you get it to stick? I've done conflict mediation in my family, like as I was mentioning, and family members are at each other's throats. I listen to one side, listen to the other, then get them to start doing empathic listening with each other, and it turns into a whole family empathy circle, and connection gets created. But unless things have recently kind of fallen apart, because with COVID, I haven't gone visiting my extended family so much, and I was just seeing there needs to be some kind of an integration, an institutionalization of these skills, because the culture is kind of driving people apart. And unless there's some kind of structures, like at dinner every day, we're going to do some rounds of empathic listening, or we're going to have a weekly family empathy circle, or you're part of a religious institution that, you go maybe and do it at the church or something. Unless it's kind of institutionalized and made on a regular ongoing basis, it seems like things are kind of like falling apart without me being there. It's been there's been sort of this conflict has been arising without somebody there to kind of hold the space. I guess that's what, religious leaders are supposed to do, right? It's like, they're the ones out there kind of hold the space, for keeping people together.
Yeah. But, what's interesting is I don't know whether you know, Tanya Singer is a very famous neuroscientist. So she's been looking at changes in the brain when you do empathy training, when you do compassion training, when you do mindfulness. And it's interesting that mindfulness, of course, has really become a big movement, and you can see it in schools and schools and businesses now, all of that sort of stuff. But I agree with Tanya that what we need is that mindfulness is okay, but it needs to be combined with empathy training and compassion training, because they do different things. Mindfulness alone, in my view, is great, but not sufficient, and how do you get these different processes? How do you get them into the schools? How do you get children practicing mindful empathy, being mindful, being empathic, and being compassion oriented? Because one of the questions that's often put to people in empathy, well, look, empathy is great, but you can use it for good or for bad. Empathy isn't always used for the good. Empathy you can use to manipulate people. If you want to be a liar, good at deceiving, you're going to be better at it if you're empathic. So it's really how these skills are used. I can listen to you very carefully and be very friendly, but what I'm trying to do is to work out how to manipulate you. So the motivation for using the skills, for me, it really does become quite important. And mindfulness is also important, that we are empathic mindfully, we're aware, we're paying attention on purpose, blah, blah, blah. So I think bringing these three processes together is really a very important thing, and getting them into the schools, I think, is very important, getting them into businesses, and how we create a society that's interested in mind awareness, mind hygiene, an adaptive functioning mind, because a lot of our minds don't function particularly well because we're all filled up with, anger or whatever it is. So mind training, I think, is such an important process,
Yeah, I talked to Tanya, I don't know, a year ago or so, had done an interview with her, and we were talking about empathy and compassion. There seems to be sort of I see that there's some kind of conflict between the approaches. And for example, you have authors like, Paul Bloom against empathy, so like, hey, empathy. And I have a whole list of articles that are out there of like, hey, empathy is terrible, you got to do compassion. So there's sort of these attacks, I would say, criticisms from the compassion community towards empathy. And, a lot of the studies, I mean, a lot of the grounding of that is the studies by Tanya Singer. So I said, hey, let's talk, and she said, well, I think people are misunderstanding what I'm saying, and maybe we should have a dialogue with the compassion community and the empathy community and have it like an empathy circle where we talk about this. And so she was up for that. Maybe we could do that, that you and I and her and maybe one other person from the empathy community have a couple hour empathy circle where we talk about these things. So the part I wanted to address was a lot depends on how we look at this, like you're saying, in terms of the empathy. It can be used for good or bad. So, and I hear that sort of criticism a lot. And I kind of, the way I've sort of addressed that is that we have lungs, right? And that the lungs take in air and, keep our body going. So inherently, the lungs are a positive thing. You can't say, hey, lungs are bad. Or you could say, hey, lungs could be used for being a psychopath, concentration camp guards or had lungs and they killed people, or, they had the firefighter has the lungs and they're out there saving people. So that empathy can be good or bad. Well, it's inherently, I see it as inherently positive in the same way as lungs are inherently positive. And the things that are the sort of the, causing pain or whatever is a different process. It's not the empathy itself. If we stay in an empathic space, I think for me, it's like an inherently constructive, positive space, as well as to bring it into the mutuality. Like a lot of times you'll hear like, people come to the empathy circle and says, I do all the listening in the family. I do all the listening. Nobody listens to me. Empathy is terrible. I feel in pain because nobody's listening to me. It's because people are seeing it from an individualistic point. They're not seeing the quality of the relationship. It's like we're in a relationship. One person is empathizing and another person is maybe not listening to the other person. It's not that the empathy is bad, is that the relationship has an empathy deficit. So when you're looking at that, hey, it can be used for positive or negative. I see it a bit differently, that what that person who's doing maybe the harm is not being empathic. And you can split your consciousness. You can be partially, empathic and partially something else. But so the empathic part is not a negative, it's a positive. And what we do is expand it to fill your consciousness, as well as to make it mutual, that we make it into a mutual consciousness. So that's kind of how I sort of see.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because we always distinguish motivation from competency. We would see empathy as a competency. Some people are good at it, some are not so good at it. You know, people on the spectrum are not so good at it. But they can be very motivated to be caring, but they're just not so good at the empathy side. So we would see it as these two, what is a competency that has evolved over a period of time, and in humans is pretty amazing competency. And that's different from motivation. And we can plot the evolution of empathy right back. I mean, Panskep and others have said, you know, empathy begins when animals begin to recognize the calls of each other, you know, in a distress. What is a distress call? So there's many interesting discussions about the origins of empathy. So we would see empathy as a competency that can be used. I mean, so what do you think happens when somebody is planning vengeance? What are they doing when are they not using some kind of empathic mind awareness to plot vengeance, to work out how they can really hurt somebody? You don't think that's an empathic process? You think it's something else that they're doing?
Yeah, it's like, I would say there's an empathic component to it. Like, hey, I'm wanting to understand where the other person is, but there's a motivation to create harm, to create pain in that person.
It's the motivation, you see.
And they're wanting to maybe balance the pain that they felt, right? It's like, hey, I felt pain by this person, so I want to give them pain back to, you know, for balance, or for I'll feel better. So the empathic so that I would say they're kind of split. Their personalities, part is they're wanting to inflict pain, and then the other is that there is this empathic sense, and we're kind of swimming in empathy anyway, just as human beings. It seems like it. And that, so what would be the empathic space would be the empathy circle, again, is how I kind of use that as the container for defining empathy. So an empathic space would be that person is listening to the person that they're wanting to harm. Like, right, it's like, okay, tell me about yourself, like who you are. They're listening, they're empathizing, but then they once that person speaks and that person has reflected back, you know, what that person is saying, then it's their turn to speak. And then when it's their turn to speak, they say, I really want to cause you pain. I want to harm you because I felt really harmed and pained by you. And then that person would say, hey, I'm hearing you really want to cause harm and pain to me because you felt that I caused pain to you, and you're wanting to get some kind of revenge. So we're taking that harm that they want to do, that revenge, and transforming it with empathy. It's being met with empathy. They met the other person with empathy. So we're bringing, and sure enough, and you see it in mediation all the time. People want to do that kind of revenge. You bring them into a mutually empathic space. They can be honest about their hate for the other person. I really hate you. You've caused me so much pain. But they're met with empathy. They're met with being heard. And it sort of takes the edge off it. Like, oh, the person's willing to listen to me. They're willing to hear me out. And it takes the edge off of that. And then they kind of go back and forth. And, you know, it can be pretty intense, but they slowly start creating a sense of connection, sense of trust, and that revenge that they want to do kind of can melt away too through that process. So I don't know if that makes sense.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think I'll come back to the other point first, but that process of how do you deal with hatred through empathy, and it's we have a series called Creating a Compassionate World, and I've been interviewing people who have been very involved in the South African Truth and Reconciliation, and the ability to bring sides together to listen to each other and focus on mutual interests, because there was some terrible bloodshed that went on between the Inkatha and the ANC and things like that. Beginning this sense of what do we have that's in our interest to actually stop these cycles of violence and vengeance? Because most tribal violence is vengeful violence. You killed my friends, I'm going to kill your friends. You did this, I'm going to do that. So these patterns of vengeance are extremely important, finding ways to kind of bring them to a close. And there's some wonderful things in the Truth and Reconciliation that address those cycles, and empathy was part of it. And empathy is also part of what we call restorative justice. You know, when you bring people who've committed crimes together with the victims of the crime, and they have an empathic dialogue. So these are all very, very important. But nonetheless, I want to take you back to this idea of that empathy is a skill and the motive is the crucial determining factor. Like, you know, if you have a torturer, right? So an empathic torture, a non-empathic torturer puts the gun to your head, but an empathic one puts it to your child's. Now, you can only do that if you understand that to see your child shot may be very different from you being experienced to be shot. That's an empathic awareness, or no other animal could do that. No lion will say, look, give up your life, I'm hungry. If you don't do that, I'm going to eat your kids. So that capacity, that awareness, you know, like housing torture victims in the first days in the cells where they can hear the screams of the others. I mean, all of that stuff, which is horrific, really. But nevertheless, it's about an understanding of what it is that creates fear in humans. If you don't understand that. So we would see that as an empathy, but a dreadful motivation. Motivation is crucial. And what you talk a lot about is the motivation to create dialogues, the motivation to reduce harm, the motivation to create a sense of connectedness between people rather than divisions between people. So you're all, in what you're doing, Edwin, is already rooted in a compassionate orientation. You're rooting that in a compassionate wish to bring people together in order to heal the divisions between them.
So you're saying, like, how do you kind of transform the torturer? It's like, what is the motivation that's going to have the torturer change to an empathic mindset?
Well, he has an empathic mindset, but not a compassionate one.
Oh, yeah. Well,
So
I would say,
yeah,
so you're saying that the compassion would be what would keep him from harming the other person. And the empathy is more of a capacity.
It's a competency, an ability.
A competency.
Yeah, we see empathy as a competency, and that without it, compassion is almost impossible. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I see the empathy as a way of being, as you're seeing maybe compassion as a way of being. There's a felt experience. If you're in an empathic state, there's skills, but there's also a way of being. There's also a felt experience to it, you know, a sense of spaciousness and openness, a receptivity to it. And that has a felt experience to it. Yeah. So I guess I see it as more than just like a skill, you know, a technical skill. It has a felt experience to it. And it's, and like, you know, Carl Rogers says, it feels damn good, which is a pretty good motivation. If things feel good, if they feel relaxed, if you feel open, you feel connected, you feel warm, you feel like you're solving problems, you're moving ahead in a constructive way, that's a pretty good motivation. It just feels, good. You know, it's like you're functional, you're dealing with less stress, and there's biological benefits to it, you know, more oxytocin, less cortisol stress hormones, you know, burning up your body, you know, physically. So there, I guess I do see that as a felt experience, and there's a motivation to want to be in that space. So in terms of the torture, I would say that they have a split where they see maybe the value of empathy for their family, right? They're probably having connections with their family that, again, I guess I see it that it's like the lungs. The empathy that they're doing is the actual empathy part where they're being sensitive is constructive in and of itself. It's the part where when they're trying to inflict harm, that they're stepping outside, so you can be split personality. So usually with people who are in conflict or who are kind of, you know, wanting to attack me or something, like, for example, I don't know if you know Breitbart, it's a conservative paper that, you know, Steve Bannon, you know, with Trump, with the supporter of Trump, you know, really wrote about. But then anyway, they wrote an article about the empathy tent, and they were very fair, saying we're trying to mediate conflict. but there was probably about 400 comments posted like, oh, the empathy tents, but a bunch of wimps, bunch of libtards, just all these criticisms. And I said, oh, great. Thanks for your comments. I would like to listen to you and empathize with you about what your concerns are. Would you like to have an empathy circle dialogue about this? So in the same way, I guess you could say the torturer, right? You could say, hey, I want to really hear why you're so angry. Why are you wanting to inflict harm? And the torturer is going to say is, my world is being threatened. Your movement that you're doing wants to hurt my family. It wants to hurt my society. So they kind of need some empathy to be heard and seen. So I guess my point is that the empathy, there's kind of this empathic space, and it's not like the empathy is the problem. The empathy needs to be expanded into more of the consciousness of the other person.
Oh yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with you. Empathy is a solution. I don't have any problem with that. Empathy is a solution, and it provides an opportunity for people to feel safe. That's key. If you don't feel safe, that's an issue. And the process of feeling listened to and so forth is an extremely important human experience, like feeling loved or cared about or valued or admired or whatever. All of these experiences have very powerful effects on how our brains and bodies and hormones work. So there's no question about that. But what you are talking about is empathy is a healing process, a healing of divisions, listening to people. So the way you present it certainly does have at its core a compassion motivation. It's not a harmful motivation. You have at its core a helpful motivation. The whole reason for doing this is because it feels good, it does good, it brings people together, it ends conflicts, ends violence, all that stuff. So at the heart of what you're saying is a compassion motivation, I would say.
Yeah, I see it as an empathic motivation. I see, because it all depends on how you're defining. We have some work starting here, so I might have to close because they're doing some drilling. I don't know if you're able to hear that.
Yeah, we can hear that, yeah.
Okay, so, but maybe we should, maybe we could continue this at, we've gone about an hour and a half, and maybe we could continue this, or also do that circle with Tanya Singer. I can reach out to her if you're interested in it, because a lot of people are.
But the most important thing, regardless of all those, whether it's a competence or a motive, is this desperate wish for both of us have to try to create a more empathic world, in your view, in my world, a more compassionate view, to move the world to a different place. And the only way we're going to do that is to have an impact on the brains and the minds of people that live on this planet, because they are the sources of all good and all harm. And if we are not able to reach individuals and help them to come together to work cooperatively as a species, really, and see the commonality that we all have and our common interests in working together and supporting each other, then I think humanity is going to struggle. So, the mission that you're on and so on is absolutely vital. If we don't change the way people think about themselves, think about their relationships, think about their connection to the world, we're going to continue to struggle. We're going to continue to be divided. We're going to continue to have tribal conflicts, which will become more and more aggressive, because that's how it works. So the work you do is absolutely wonderful. And I'm so delighted you invited me to come and talk with you, Edwin. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I really hear that you're really looking how to be sort of effective in getting compassion out there, how to reach others, and what will be a way to kind of spread that message. So,
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, and you're really working hard to look for that. It's almost like you're looking in all the different corners. Like, what's the solution? How do we do this? How do we?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Empathy, what you're doing, it has to be a fundamental aspect of it, because without that, I don't think compassion gets very far. It just doesn't, it doesn't even really start. Unless you can make a connectedness and have a sensitivity to the suffering in others, you wouldn't even start. So the empathy is a very fundamental aspect of compassion.
Well, I would love to continue the conversation, to go into, I just love your thought process, the details, effective, just the way you're really approaching this and all the work. I mean, it's just totally amazing how productive you've been, in total awe of that. So, okay, well, we'll end. We're doing electrical work here, so the workers came and they're starting to do drilling, so it's
Okay,
getting a
no
little
worries.
loud.
Okay.
So, okay, well, great talking to you.
Lovely talking to you, Edwin. Catch
All
up
right.
later. Take
Okay,
care.
bye.
Bye.